Hey folks, thanks for joining me today. We need to talk about how to do a project in welding. All right, friends, so in welding here, we do some projects. Now, the beginning students do not do projects. They just learn to weld. But the more advanced students, they will do a project. And when you do a project, there are some things that you have to do before, during, and after you weld that project. So, before you weld that project, what we require is you have to have at least 3 pages of documents. The first thing you have to have is you have to have a detailed sketch of your project. So, say I'm doing a project, a fireplace rack to hold lumber. So I need to have a front, top, right side view, and then like a 3-dimensional sketch of it. It needs to look like how it will be in the end. So that will be a standalone page. Your sketch will be a standalone page. The second page will be your materials list. What materials will you need to have on hand to make this project? Also, along with your sketches, we need detailed dimensions. We have to know how big this thing is so we can make it accurately based on our sketch. So that's where your materials list, you look at your sketch to get your materials list. So if I'm building this firewood rack, I need to know what size of rod I'm going to use. I also need to know every single length, and I also want to put in there how many electrodes or wire I think I'm going to use. That's another reason why beginning students don't do projects, because they don't know how much rod it may take to do a project. I've been welding a while, or I've been welding for a whole year, or I've been welding for 17 years, whatever. You have an idea of how many rods it'll take you to tack up the things and then weld up all the welds on it. So that goes in your materials list. The material used, all the metal, and how many rods you think you're going to use. Now, if this has a lot of other types of operations, maybe you're going to need to grind a whole lot on it. You'll need to put grinding discs in the materials list. Okay, the third thing, the third sheet you will need before you even start making your project is your timeline. How long will this take you? Now we want to break it down to the very smallest amount of time. So how many minutes, how many hours, how many days? It's not good to say days here because we deal with class periods. And so if you say it'll take me 4 days, well, for someone's 4 days out in the industry, that's a lot of time. But here, if you're on a 45-minute period, that's only like 3.5 hours. So it's not that big a deal. So we want to break it down to minutes. And if we have like 400 minutes, let's break that down to hours. How many hours and then minutes it's going to take to do this. That way, we can see how much it would cost us if we were doing this to sell, or if we were doing this at a job, how much the employer would need to charge for it. Okay, along with that timeline, we need to do all the steps. We need to think through what this project is going to entail, and we need to write down what the different processes. So you can't just say, well, it's going to take me 2 hours to weld it up. Awesome, great. How many hours or how many minutes is it going to take you to cut the material? How many minutes or hours is it going to take you to tack and fabricate the material? Maybe yours doesn't have a whole lot of fabrication, but if your project has holes that you have to tap or threads that you have to make, that's fabrication time. So we need to include that in our timeline to give us an accurate picture of what this is going to take. So those are your 3 sheets you have to have before you even begin doing any cutting or welding or whatever. So before you start, you need a detailed sketch with dimensions, you need a materials list, and you need a timeline. So now you started your project, you're working on it. What you need to do now is be thinking of revisions. If you change anything from the initial sketch, that needs to be documented and have a revision sheet. Add a new sheet, new sketch, revision. And that should also affect your timeline and your materials list. So you absolutely have to have a revision sheet with your initial 3-sheet project, unless you don't do any revisions at all. If there's nothing you change at all, that's fine. Totally fine. If you're halfway through and you realize, you know what, I'm going to have to grind on this a lot. So you go back to your timeline and say revisions plus 2 hours grinding. So that is your revision sheet. Then, once you are totally finished, you're totally done with your project, it is complete, totally done, there's some things you need to do. You need to, number one, analyze your project, your timeline, with what you thought it would take to what it actually took. See how those differ. If you thought, you know what, this is going to be a simple project, not going to take me long at all, it's going to take me like 2 hours total time, but then you forgot that, wow, I had to cut many more pieces than I thought, and they had some angles on them, so it actually took me another half an hour to an hour more of just cutting time. We need to analyze that and see what it looks like after the project's done, so we can get a better idea in the future going forward of how long a project's going to take. The next thing we're going to need, we need to look at our materials list. How many materials did I use? How many electrodes did I use? What did I say I was going to use? What did it look like at the beginning? So maybe I said, oh, you know what, it's going to take no time at all. I'm going to use 5 electrodes, but then it came back, you actually used 10 because the welds needed a thicker weld or a longer weld or whatever. We need to document that so in the future we can have a good idea of what it's going to take, and we can charge correctly and not lose money on a project that we thought was only going to take half a pound of electrode and it ends up taking 4 pounds of electrodes. So there you go, folks. That's what you need to have when you do a project. You need your documents that you're done before you do anything. You need your revisions, and then you need your final documentation and analyzation of what it actually took. Hey, thanks so much for watching, folks. Make sure you work hard on those projects. Do the hard work beforehand, do the mental work, and then do the hard work while you're in it, because hard work is its own reward. Thanks for watching.